Hey, what's up? Hello, everyone. Welcome into Fantasy Filmball, the show where we turn movies into sports and sports into something we don't talk about here. My name is Matt.
And my name is Dyl. Welcome to our 2025 Best Picture Revisiting Series.
Here are the 10 nominees for Best Motion Picture of the Year.
Honora.
The Brutalist.
A Complete Unknown.
Conclave.
Dune, Part 2.
Amelia Perez.
I'm Still Here.
Nickel Boys.
The Substance.
And Wicked.
And on today's episode, we'll be discussing Conclave, which racked up 8 Academy Award nominations. And we are joined by a very special guest and a friend of the channel, Austin.
Today is going to be a very mysterious episode because we're here talking about this year's fun Agatha Christie-esque paperback novel thriller, Conclave, one of the top films in this year's Best Picture race. And before we get into everything, I just want to say I saw this back at TIFF in September, and I really enjoyed the film. But while I did enjoy it quite a lot, I didn't quite see it as the Oscar contender, blown away film that it seems like everyone else did. For me, as a huge fan of All Quiet on the Western Front, it was a little bit of a tiny baby step down, even though I had a ton of fun watching it. This has been sort of lower on my Best Picture ranking all year long. But on a rewatch, I found myself enjoying it much, much more. I thought this was just a really fun, good time at the movies, and I'm anxious to hear what do you guys think about this one.
I also saw this at a festival. I saw this at Mill Valley back in October, and I got swept up in it at the time, seeing it with a big crowd, like all the twists and turns. It's a really fun, really well-made movie. Rewatching it in the last couple days, I came out a little bit more on the negative side. I still think it's a very good, well-made movie, but it doesn't quite hold up to scrutiny in a lot of interesting ways that we can get into. But overall, like, the crafts are all strong, but for me, it kind of ends up being less than the sum of its parts.
And I guess I'll come in on the opposite angle because I find that every time I watch Conclave, I just love how many more new special things that you can uncover with the script because it's so sharp. I mean, it's fresh off of its BAFTA winning screenplay. It won at the Critics' Choice. It won at the Golden Globes. It's probably going to go on to win at the Oscars. And I think this is one of the best scripts that we had, regardless of its original or adapted for the entirety of the year last year. And I just really like how there's little hidden details, especially upon a rewatch that you can hear. And since this is a revisiting episode, spoilers are fully open. So, like, the movie starts off, we had that interaction between the Cardinals coming in and learning about the Pope's passing away, and I like that line, that throwaway line of dialogue where Aldo's talking with Lawrence and saying, like, oh, he always lost to the Pope in chess because the Pope was always 2 steps ahead. And there's so many stuff like that throughout the remainder of the film that the first viewing I had, I didn't watch it at a festival. I watched it at a press screening right before festival I was showing at, so a little bit of a different of a setting. And I remember walking in there. This was after it had its world premiere at Telluride, after it screened at TIFF, and a lot of people in the room were like, this film is probably going to be boring. Like, who cares about the election of a new pope? And walking out of that film, almost everyone was in unison saying, this is one of the best movies of the year, and I would tend to agree with them.
It was really funny that we kept writing it off. I mean, I know that we had it in our Best Picture lineup pretty early on, but even then, we kept saying, something feels wrong about this. It feels a little bit too light. It feels like, one of those airport paperbacks that you'd pick up from a convenience store, and like it had that sort of vibe to it, which we took as a detractor for award season. But I think that's kind of exactly why this film has been so embraced. It's just a fun, light, easy movie. It's got a bit of a serious subject to it. It looks like it should be serious, but it's goofy, it's silly, and it's really light. Now, Austin, to what you're saying, that, we can pick it apart and we can kind of find the flaws in there. We absolutely can. This is not a deep film. It's a very surface level mystery with some fun flair to it. If you're going for those nuances, you're probably not going to find them. But if you're staying at that surface level and just looking for a really fun time at the movies, this is definitely good enough.
So to continue with some of my additional thoughts on Conclave's Best Picture nomination, you could say this film is a little bit on the nose with how it is a one-to-one parallel of the U.S. democratic process. You listen to interviews with Berger, with the screenwriter. The funny thing is, they had no clue of the stuff going on over here. They were working on this film well ahead of this year's political race, and it's really interesting to see the parallels and how stuff really plays out, because it's like Conclave. You had this very far left leaning cardinal of Aldo, who wants equality, wants to have an equal playing field for all, and isn't willing to back down from his morals to make sure that the way that he wants things to be isn't clear out in the open. And then you have on the flip side, the far right, you have Tedesco, a man who is upfront about everything, regardless of how off-putting things can be. And it's just so interesting to see how the election of the new pope amongst a group of cardinals really matches up with the election of a president here in the United States. Adeyemi, which is my personal supporting actor performance inside the film, he has a long-lost child from an affair. Tremblay is embezzling funds from the church. And Aldo acts all high-and-mighty, but in reality, he is seeking out this role, even though he's telling everyone he doesn't care. It's not for me, but secretly, he doesn't want it. And then we get to our man Lawrence, and this guy, as Matt said, he's lost all his faith. And honestly, the only one who doesn't have any faults, at least hidden faults, is Tedesco, because like I said, he expresses all his hateful and bigotry up front and is open and honest about it. That's why he has such a following inside this election, at least in the early stages. And I just love how the film proposes these questions of like, is anyone truly without sin? Because in reality, we all have blemishes, we all have black marks on our lives. It's just like some may be from decades ago, some may be from something that we did just last night. But does that fully recontextualize our character to every individual that we know, that we've bonded with, that we've interacted with? I would say no. And Conclave as a whole seems to agree.
Now, something that I feel about this one is it's like an entire season of a TV show kind of jammed into one movie. And that could be either a positive or a negative, depending how you feel about TV as a medium, because a lot of the time I find myself disengaged from TV shows because they are so talky. They kind of drive with dialogue first instead of visuals, and that's sort of what the difference is between TV and film. And here, a criticism that I've definitely heard is it does have that sort of feeling of TV rather than cinema. And so, yeah, I think that's just generally how I come down on this film. Now, after it won the BAFTA award this weekend, I just want to know, do you guys see a path for this winning Best Picture at the Oscars?
It really comes down to SAG, which is happening this weekend. If Conclave surprises with a win in ensemble there, it will have BAFTA, it will have SAG, and kind of go toe-to-toe with Honora's CCA and PGA and DGA. But I still think Conclave is probably just like a little too light on those number one votes. People have been saying all year long, this film will do phenomenal on a preferential ballot. But we've seen that play out so far, and it lost over to Honora. And I think it's kind of funny that this film won at a place where it's strictly number ones, being the BAFTA. And maybe that is the BAFTA's love for Edward Berger. I mean, they showered All Quiet. Conclave didn't get showered as much, but still won multiple major prizes, screenplay, editing, picture. So, like, I think it's very firmly top three. We've had this conversation with Conclave all year long, like you're talking about, Matt, where we started off kind of high on it. We dropped it down a little bit. It came soaring back up. I had at number one for like a month or so, and then we both kind of dropped it down the ranks. I was like, well, it didn't win at the Globe. Where can it win at? And I guess BAFTA, maybe SAG, but I don't think it will win Best Picture.
It's interesting because we've said all along that if you want to win Best Picture, you have to win at least PGA, DGA, or WGA. And Conclave doesn't have any of those. It could win SAG, but historically, even that has not been enough to win Picture. But it's interesting this year because Conclave was not eligible for WGA. And I think we can say pretty confidently that it would have won there. So maybe we'll see a stat break this year. It definitely has a path through adapted screenplay and maybe editing, maybe score, all still in play. Mm-hmm. So if it does win, it'll make sense, but also be a little stat breaking at the same time.
Well, it has the Argo package right now, right? Where in terms of at least wins, not precursors, because Argo basically swept the precursors. But it does have adapted screenplay and likely editing, and that could be its path to Best Picture. That said, I don't feel confident in it like you, Dylan. I just struggle to see this getting the number ones that it needs and the high ranks that it needs on a preferential ballot. I see this being, everyone's number 4, number 5, and very few people's number 1, 2, or 3. But maybe I'm just wrong about that. I could completely be off base. But I do just kind of keep thinking back to that BAFTA curse. Winning BAFTA is not always a good thing for your picture chances unless you also have PGA. I mean, since 2010, I want to say, We've had like only 5 out of 15 movies have won the BAFTA for Best Picture and then the Oscar for Best Picture.
There would be no mystery, and therefore no need for faith. Let us pray that God will grant us a pope who doubts, and let him grant us a pope who sins and asks for forgiveness and who carries on.
I mean, you talk about the BAFTA curse, and I would also extend that out to the frontrunner fatigue curse, because maybe not so much in the Best Picture category, but over in the Best Leading Actor category. There was months on end at the early point of this season where everyone was saying, hey, it's Ralph Fiennes' time to shine, because I mean, hey, this is a guy that we've seen throughout our lives as cinema fans, even if it's something that you may not know that you've seen him in, because of course he was in the Academy Award winning Schindler's List, he was in Wes Anderson's magnum opus, The Grand Budapest Hotel, but for non-film buffs or hardcore cinephiles, he was in the Harry Potter series as Voldemort. Everyone has seen Ralph Fiennes do something in his illustrious catalog and his filmography, but now we really get to see him play a role that really showcases his talents in a brand new way. And like, yes, you can be a little bit on the nose and compare this to Cillian Murphy and Oppenheimer last year. It's not as much as a vocal, out there screaming type performance. It's laid back, it's chill, it's subtle, but he's doing so much with so little throughout this. But Fiennes, he's a master of his craft, and he doesn't need to be shouting or screaming like a lot of the other nominees here, but what he's doing is so great, especially inside these walls of the Vatican. And I really like the direction that the screenplay allows Fiennes to take Lawrence's character. It really gives him this space and this room to flex his acting chops, starting off as someone who wants no part of what we're watching unfold. But the further that we go inside the film, the more that he uncovers about the former Pope's, I guess you could say, journey that he laid out for him inside of this film. Fiennes really gets the opportunity to eat up these scenes, and as he's becoming more invested inside this conclave, he takes up the shepherd mantle, as they talk about inside the film. He becomes the manager of the election, and it's just so fun. It's so invigorating to watch play out. And while Fiennes wouldn't be my personal win pick of this year, I think that he's a pretty great nominee amongst our bunch of lead actors this year, which I think is the best crop we've had in a very, very long time.
He's a very internal, more complex character than we typically see. He's got a lot of, he's kind of positioned in the middle of the conclave, where he's got like the devil and the angel on his shoulder at all times, like Bellini on one side, like, hey, we need to band together against Tedesco, and then on the other side, we need to be more accepting of all beliefs, even those that are more problematic. And that's, that sort of gets into my personal problems with the movie, but not to get into politics too much, but it's a little frustrating watching him at times, like waffling, like, oh, what should I do, when like it should be more obvious in my opinion. But yeah, Fiennes plays it very well. It's very you can feel the conflicts playing out just in his facial expressions, and he doesn't have to say a lot for you to feel what he's feeling.
I think Fiennes is wonderful in this. He plays the subtleties of the role with nuance. He can never be too big, right? He can never show emotion. He has to keep things under control, because if he shows that he's losing control, if he shows that he's losing faith, then he loses the control and the faith of everyone else in the papal conclave. I really like his portrayal of this character as a man who is losing his faith in God, when instead he should be losing faith in the church. That's sort of counterpointed with the sort of unseen puppet master of all of this, with the deceased pope, because the deceased pope was someone who kept his faith in God, but lost his faith in the church instead. And I do love that sort of interplay, and how Fiennes takes us on a journey where it's almost like we see him gaining his faith in God back, while he sort of loses faith in the integrity of the institution and on the integrity of the people around him. Because at the beginning of the movie, it's almost as though he believes he's a fraud. It's almost as though he sees himself as unworthy of being a cardinal, because he does not hold the same belief, the same faith that he thinks everyone else does. And the journey through the film is him sort of unraveling that maybe for most of these people, this is just a political game. This is just a power play. And maybe the integrity that I thought that they all had, they don't actually have. And what does that say about this institution? And what does that say about my place in this institution? Maybe I am more faithful. Maybe I am more good in that way. I don't know. I really love the way that he portrays those nuances in the character. And though I agree with you, Austin, I don't think that the script always gives him the most nuance in his actions. I do think that he finds a lot, even just below the lines. In the subtext, he is doing so much with this role while doing so very little.
I've said it before, and I have to say it again here on the channel. Sister Agnes, I must confess my sins. I doubted your performance before watching this film. All throughout award season, I said, oh, you can't get nominated with 7 minutes of screen time. But Isabella Rossellini, she proved us all wrong, because this performance is so wonderful, to use your word, Matt, in such a limited amount of screen time, because that one monologue is the ultimate mic drop moment of the entirety of 2024. And honestly, it's probably the most memorable sequence of the entirety of Conclave. It's the one that gets the people talking. It's the way that Rossellini's delivery, her little curtsy bow at the end of the monologue, it just works. It's infectious. It's fun to talk about. It's one when I watched at home this most recent time, I had to rewind it because I was like, I want to watch that sequence again, because while her performance is so good, she's also giving those spaces and those breaths inside of it to allow the rest of the Cardinals inside of the room to really react. And maybe they're not saying anything, it's just their body postures, but she's playing off of that. And this is just a fun nomination. It's the true definition of what a supporting performance is. And you know, we have to give a shout out to the Academy. They don't always nominate leads in this category. They can go up for some true supporting performances.
I'm still not quite convinced about Isabella Rossellini here. I think that she has one fantastic scene, but aside from that, you know, she just kind of fades into the background, which is the point of her character. And it is nice to see a true supporting performance nominated for the Oscars. At the same time, though, I do just feel like outside of that one monologue, this is going to be a nomination that we sort of look back on in a few years and go, that's the one time Isabella Rossellini, a fantastic performer with a long and varied career, that's the one time that she got a nomination. It just feels like everyone's kind of admitting it's her time. She's been looked over far too many times for what a great career she's had. I just, you know, this role is not the best encapsulation of her legacy, in my opinion, even though she kills it in those few scenes.
Yeah, to me, that's a case of the screenplay kind of propping up the role, where she, as you said, she only has 6-7 minutes of screen time, but thematically, she has a bigger sort of presence in the background. There's sort of an underlying theme in the film of the male-female dynamic that's sort of left unspoken, and I kind of wish that the movie had delved a little bit deeper into that. It kind of, you could say it ties in a little bit to the twist ending, which I'm sure we'll get to, but I definitely would have liked to see more of the behind the scenes play of what the sisters are doing in the background, because we only see that 1 or 2 times really throughout the whole movie.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it does seem like it's what Peter Strawn wants the crux of the movie to be, is this sort of dynamic between the nuns and the cardinals, because you know, multiple times it's mentioned that what Bellini wants is more equality between men and women within the Vatican and within the church as a whole. And that moving towards that sort of twist of the new pope being intersex and sort of what that means. Can a pope have these female reproductive organs? There's so much that it seems like it wants to say. And even ending, the final shot of the movie is we are looking through Cardinal Lawrence's eyes as he looks down upon the courtyard and hears 2 nuns laughing and they walk across the frame. And that's the final shot of the movie. So it's leaving us with the final image being the joy of women in the church. And it is very interesting that despite this being clearly something they wanted to talk about, Isabella Rossellini is still relegated to just having that one scene and then disappearing for the rest of the film.
She was indeed here at the specific request of Cardinal Tremblay.
To to talk about the screenplay, because I think we've been circling around it for a little bit, the screenplay is where this movie lives or dies. It needs to balance the seriousness of the Vatican with a level of high camp and ridiculousness to kind of sell that political power play, backstabbing feel of the film. It has to craft these compelling mysteries as well as crafting the reveals afterwards. And altogether, although I think again on a surface level this is really, really solid and it's being executed beautifully, it's definitely not as layered as I would have liked in terms of its political read. I would have liked to also see it push even deeper into some of the twists and turns, get even sillier than it does with some of the politics and some of the backstabbing that happens. I think it could have pushed some of that a little bit further, but it's definitely successful in its aims. Also, gotta say, that parts of this feel like a straight rip of John Patrick Shanley's Doubt, specifically Cardinal Lawrence's monologue at the beginning about how doubt is a part of faith and certainty is the enemy of faith, basically. That monologue feels almost exactly like one of the monologues coming from Doubt. And so I don't know. I'm not one to really get hung up on like, oh, it was too inspired by something else. But I felt a lot of doubt in this, and I haven't seen people talking about that as much as I feel like they maybe should.
I haven't seen Doubt, but I seem to be the biggest Conclave fan here. Shout out to Pope Crave, carrying the internet right now. But like this screenplay is, like I said before, I think it is the best adapted work of the year, is because you're taking this airport novel that some have called campy, a quick read, but it gives it, at least to me, a lot of substance, making it so thrilling, so engaging, and very gripping. Because like I haven't read the novel, but I've heard people who have read the novel, and they say that this is a step up from the book. Like I said before, you wouldn't think a film about the election of a new pope would be so funny. It wouldn't be so brilliant. It wouldn't be so gripping. But these twists, while sometimes may be predictable, it's not really the grand point. Despite the predictability, you're just along for the ride. And what the movie does, especially for the allegories of like the real world parallels and its proposed questions, all for me on each viewing has hit harder with real world parallels that we've seen play out with either elections or politics across the globe, of those of like, is anyone truly without sin? Are people redeemable? And my favorite of all the questions that Conclave proposes to us is what sins are truly worth being ignored and which ones are a deconstruction of character. And I think looking at Conclave through those lenses, at least for me, has elevated this film upon each rewatch. But I do agree with some of the points that y'all have made, is there are rooms for improvement to make the film a little bit more hard hitting, but for me it works as a proposing of those questions more so than tackling them head on.
Yeah, as you said, Matt, it feels like we're getting a full season of television in just 2 hours, and I think that's the biggest strength of the screenplay, is the pacing, how it's able to keep everything moving along. It introduces us to a lot of different characters, all of which are pretty well fleshed out. We kind of get a good sense of who each of them are, and that ties in also to the editing and the score, which both stood out to me on rewatch. Is just, this movie just moves really well. There's a great sense of energy to every scene. Like I said, even if you look deeper and sort of dig into some of the nuances, it maybe doesn't hold up, but it doesn't matter when you're just watching it in the theater, because those hours fly by and it's just a lot of fun.
It's just 2 hours long, but I think it is the shortest runtime of all our nominees this year. And upon watching this most recently at home, like, it just flies by. And they both have this brisk pace where you always feel like you're moving forward, you're never looking back. They allow the scenes to breathe while also not feeling like you're rushing through any particular moments throughout. And it all feels perfectly timed. And I think it's very worthy of its BAFTA editing win. And of our nominees that we have at the Oscars, this one probably would get my vote, because you talk about the score as well, and I mentioned this in our Brutalist episode last time around, but I love when films edit to the music, and Conclave does that as well, and I think it does a really great job of doing that. And whether it's in the voting scenes where you're able to see every cardinal's reaction, so you never feel like you're spending too much time with one, it feels equally dispersed throughout. I don't really know how they pulled off the editing inside this film to make it as dynamic as it is, but it's one of the biggest highlights of the film to me.
On the other hand, I mean, I'm gonna say this in a negative way, and I'm gonna sound so much more negative on this movie than I actually am. I like it a lot. This is not my bottom of the best picture. I like this movie. I'm just gonna sound a little bit more negative here. The editing to me is TV editing, and I do say that in a way that's a little derogatory. It cuts to whoever's talking. It's serviceable. It gives you good coverage of the dialogue scenes, but very little that the editing is doing is actually, I think, guiding the audience through the story rather than just uh, in a way deeper than just saying this person's talking, so we're on them. This person's talking, so we're on them. I don't know. I think just going back to the thing that we keep saying about this, it does kind of have that look and feel of TV. It's like a full season kind of packed into one 2-hour movie where, every single time one of those cardinals has their downfall, it's like that's an entire arc of like 2 or 3 episodes. And I think that's a really cool thing about the script. But in terms of the editing, I just feel like it's doing what it needs to, but it's rarely doing anything to elevate the form. It's just cutting exactly the way you'd expect, exactly the way that you want. Sometimes that's good enough. I don't know if I can get behind this being an editing win, because while it is fast, it is well paced. It feels like TV editing.
Well, we've kind of said that the screenplay, the edit, the score kind of all work together. So why don't we dive into the score? Because Volker, he's everyone's most despised composer at the moment for stealing that Oscar away from Babylon. And I'm not the biggest fan of his All Quiet win, but I think the score is a very good score from top to bottom. But I think that his Conclave score is even a step up from that, because it's this rhythm that we have in the screenplay, the editing, the score. As I keep saying, I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over again, but they all work so well together to keep this film feeling like it's a freight train of intense, gripping feels throughout. And I feel like if you remove one of these elements, it just wouldn't work as well as it does. And I think the most important thing here is the score is memorable, it's very fun, and it works inside the film as well as outside of the movie. This is one that you can easily put on your headphones as you're going for a walk, and you can feel the energy. And it's one that when you're watching the film, it really immerses you into whatever scene that you're watching.
I love the score. Love the score. It's so good. It's so good. Now, I am a defender of the All Quiet score. I think the blah, blah, blah is like phenomenal. It's some of my favorite music work in the last decade in film. I love it. And this doesn't quite hit the highs that I think All Quiet does, but this is so fun. From those first moments where the credits come up on screen and we're kind of just immersed into that booming score. Oh, I love it. I love how it drives the seriousness, drives the tension, which makes it all feel even more ridiculous, because it's like the music is telling us, take this seriously, take this very seriously. And then they're all just like little goofballs with vapes and everything. It's wonderful, wonderful music.
I hate the criticism of the All Quiet score as like, oh, it's only 3 notes. Like, how could 3 notes when it's like Jaws is 2 notes, and that's one of the greatest scores of all time. But
Thank you.
anyway, yeah. And
Thank you.
This is a much more traditional score, but I think it shows that Volker Bertelmann has a great ability to fit the tone of the movie. Like in All Quiet, it's very ominous score, sort of fits the unsettling feeling of that movie. And here it's more upbeat, more orchestral, more just zippy, moving along. And that's what the movie needed, is to keep the energy up. And he did a good job of fitting that.
So I'd love to talk about production design and costume design together, because I think that these two categories work completely in tandem. And it's just the way that they recreate these Vatican sets, the Vatican costumes. And the big question here, and what makes it such great work in both the production design and the costume design, is that question of what do you modernize and what do you keep classical? Because this is such a traditional, old-fashioned setting that this movie's in, and the costumes that they wear are very traditional. They look exactly the way that they've looked for 1,000 years. But what I find so interesting about the work in both of these departments is the question that the designers had to ask themselves. What do you update so that people watching this movie know that this is set in 2024? This is not set 1,000 years ago. What do you change and update so that we know we are watching the modern era? And that's where I think both of these elements shine the brightest. Those small little touches that show us this is a contemporary film, right? It won the Costume Designers Guild and the Art Directors Guild in the contemporary category, despite looking like it could have been set 1,000 years ago. But it's that question, what do you change to modernize things? And I think it does that brilliantly.
I really like what you said. And I think going more so to the production design side of things is like they recreate the Vatican. Like if you watch this movie and you didn't know that, you would think this is the real place, and that is an achievement of production design. But then over for the costumes, like you mentioned, it's the little things they do to add to make it more modern, but it's also there's so much costume work here, and it looks like they went to the actual Vatican, plucked all the robes from like their wardrobe department and said, hey, put these on. And like Lawrence has so many eye-popping outfits throughout, and you think, hey, I'm gonna watch a movie about popes, I'm gonna watch a movie about cardinals. How cool can the costumes look? And like, I'm not an overtly religious person, but like that strip, those robes, they're so cool. I want one. I want to walk around. They look so snazzy. They look so cool. It's great work, and I'm glad that it was able to find its way to overcome that more modern contemporary bias to get into the Oscars in these two categories.
Yeah, I remember before the nominations came out, there was some sort of naysayers to the production design nomination saying like, yes, they recreated the Sistine Chapel, but so did the two popes, and that didn't get nominated. But I think the difference here is Edward Berger really lingers on these sets and really shows he wants us to feel the weight of these sort of hallowed grounds and the characters existing within these centuries old buildings. And we can talk about the cinematography later because that did not get nominated, but I think that goes hand in hand with it because Edward Berger has a much more visual approach to these to the story. Even though it's a very dialogue heavy film, he also is he's showing the weight of the sets and how it sort of bears down on Lawrence and the other characters.
I don't think the production design is just about the Sistine Chapel or those sort of big halls. It's also really impressive how they make the small hallways, the little passageways, the offices, the spaces that we don't think of as holy spaces into visually pleasing environments. Because normally, like I think of a lot of those hallways as being some of the worst places to shoot for films, but they really do make it intriguing to look at. There's just choices in the colors of the doors or the way that the marble looks on the walls. There's just small things, and it turns spaces that typically could be seen as quite ugly or uncinematic into beautiful movie locations.
I was who I had always been. It seemed to me more of a sin to change his handiwork than to leave my body as it was.
So you are still
I am what God made me. And perhaps it is my difference that would make me more useful.
And now Conclave, it did rack up 8 Academy Award nominations, but you'd probably be like weirded out to hear that that's less than it received from most of the other major bodies. BAFTA, Critics' Choice, it led with nominations, 10 plus at those places. And here, what's missing, like Austin said, cinematography is probably the biggest one because it got every precursor ahead of time. And like, is it the most flashy work of the year? It's definitely not. But as Matt was saying, the way that they film inside of these locations, whether it's the hallways, it is the big rooms, or like Austin saying, lingering on these shots to really bask in the glory of the recreation of the Vatican is very great work. And one thing I'll talk about with the cinematography, it also kind of leads over into the directing, which also got snubbed, is I really like the way that they do the blocking inside of Conclave. I know Matt said for the editing, it kind of feels like TV editing, which can be seen as a positive, can be seen as negative. And I guess that can be carried over to cinematography as well, as like how they're framing all these shots does feel kind of TV-esque, but I feel like there's just like a little added touch to it that makes it feel cinematic and makes it very beautiful and easy on the eyes. And like I said before, is this going to be like the Dunes, the Brutalists, the Marias, where you can just pause any scene and be like, oh my gosh, that's a lock screen, that's the most beautiful shot of the year? No, but it is something that I think is very effective inside the movie that it's from.
It's solid craft work, the same way that A Complete Unknown is solid craft work. It's not like reinventing the form or doing anything new, but it looks nice the entire way through. I really like the way that it uses shadows, the way that it creates more dynamic images by casting those hard shadows. It's very reminiscent of a lot of Renaissance and medieval art that the church would have been patrons of. I think of like Caravaggio. There's a lot of scenes that have those sort of hard cut chiaroscuro. The Overall, for me, the cinematography looks like it could have been ripped from an episode of House of Cards, which I think is a positive in the way that it's sort of emulating that very famous TV show about politics in DC, and the way that that show uses shadows in those sort of government spaces. I feel like is very reminiscent of what Conclave is trying to do. But this sort of takes me back to that whole TV complaint because, like, again, it does feel like House of Cards the entire time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would disagree a little bit with Dylan because this is going to be super blasphemous to say, but I was reminded a little bit of Barry Lyndon with this movie, where obviously Edward Berger is no Stanley Kubrick, but it feels like he's setting up the framing where it feels like sort of Renaissance paintings. Like a lot of the still frames of this movie feel like something that could be painted on a mural inside a chapel or in a cathedral.
Well, Austin, we may not agree with you on that fact, and you may not agree that Edward Berger is the next Stanley Kubrick. But the BAFTAs do. They love this guy. They'll give his film multiple awards. They'll give him director nominations every time. The Oscars, though, they have something against him. They can't nominate him for director for anything. All Quiet, arguable number 2 film in Best Picture, no nomination. Hero of Conclave again, arguable number 2 film in Best Picture, no nomination as well. So I guess I throw it over to y'all. Why do y'all think he keeps coming up short? This time around, it wasn't like he was a complete unknown. He had every precursor. He was guaranteed the nomination, and then the day comes, his name is just not there.
I have no problem with that. I think that Edward Berger, his films are very well done, but I think that they could have been as well done by basically anyone. Yeah, I feel like anyone could have gotten Conclave and made a movie as good, as fun as this, because it's in the script, it's in the acting. I don't see the direction as particularly needing an award.
It's interesting because both of his last 2 movies, Conclave and All Quiet, he wouldn't have made my personal top 5, but just looking at the film's sort of placement in the race, like you could say he should have gotten in for both of them. And it really shows just sort of how insidery and isolated the director's branch is, where they like their familiar names. Well, it's funny to say because this year was all first-time nominees, but they like their auteurs. They don't like sort of outsiders who haven't sort of put in their dues, I guess. And there might be a sense that Edward Berger is just too new and hasn't done enough to put his own stamp on his films yet. Maybe they just feel he doesn't have the identity yet.
Enough of Conclave snubs. We're getting into, I think, the highlight of these Best Picture Revisiting episodes here in our guest preferential ballot. So, Austin, this year we have 10 nominees, and at least Matt and I seem to like most of these. Our guests, on the other hand, have clearly shown one film is always their number 10. Are you continuing that trend, or are you switching things up here?
I'm not, and I'm probably going to get some hate for this, but I don't have the same number 10 as everyone else. But I guess I'll start from the bottom then. But my number 10 is a complete unknown. My number 9 is Wicked. Both of those I think are just kind of safe and like just not for me, just boring studio movies to me. Sorry. My number 8, unfortunately, is Conclave. My number 7 is Emilia Perez. I know, but I think at least that movie's taken some risks and trying to do something different, even if it doesn't always succeed. My number 6 is I'm Still Here. My number 5 is The Substance. And then there's a pretty big jump up to number 4. My 1 through 4, I think, are all pretty much masterpieces. But number 4, I have The Brutalist. Number 3, Nickel Boys. Number 2, Anora. And number 1, best sci-fi movie ever made, Dune Part 2.
You are joining a big club right here because I think Dune Part 2 has been absolutely dominating with our ballots that we've been getting. I don't know what that says about the pool that we're drawing from, but Dune Part 2 has been at the top of a lot of people's lists.
It's a very interesting race because this is the fun thing about doing a preferential ballot is you kind of see the skew between everything because Dune Part 2 dominated early on, but this is episode 8 of our series. We haven't had a top placement for Dune since episode 2. Another film in that time has racked up a lot, so I think we're going to come down to the wire between Dune and one other film, which one can really be the top dog here of the series. series.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Austin, and for discussing all of your thoughts around Conclave. Now, where can we find you in the meantime?
You can find me hanging out on the Discord server or on the Oscar Race subreddit. I'm usually lurking around there. If you want to debate 2026 contenders with me, I'll be over there.
That's a wrap on episode 8 of our 2025 Best Picture Revisiting series. Here's the current combined leaderboard for both our guest and Matt and I's preferential ballot. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where Matt's fiance will be joining us to discuss Wicked.